Hi guys, so this is the first of the Sunday panel. This is the 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock. This is with Caroline Dunford and Chris Longmuir, and this is the historical fiction. So we're just going to start. So Chris Longmuir is a novelist as well as a short story and article writer. She's a member of several professional writing organisations and is a founding member of Angus Writing Circle. She's been writing since 1990. She has many short stories and articles published, as well as monologues and theatre. More recently, she's concentrated on novel writing, and she's interested in crime writing, contemporary and historical, which is good. Awards include the Scottish Association of Writers Pitlochry Award for books Night Watcher and Deadwood. And Deadwood won the Dundee International Book Prize in 2009. And since then, she published the contemporary Dundee crime series. She's also published a historical crime series, The Christy Campbell, for Dundee's first policewoman, which was set after the First World War. She also, after her crime novels, she published a historical set in Scotland, Fishing Village, in the 1830s, and the Nuts and Bolts of Self-Publishing. And she's currently working on another historical novel featuring Christy Campbell. And Caroline Dunford, who writes historical fiction, thrillers, crime fiction, romance, and diverse plays. She's also working on Why a Young Adult novel. She has currently 25 books published, and she's always writing. She's a part-time teacher fellow at Edinburgh University, designing and teaching courses in writing in the contemporary department. She enjoys teaching writers of all abilities from age 12 upwards. She runs workshops in our local libraries and the Edinburgh International Book Fair. And these have ranged from beginner writing workshops to themed events. Her Euphemia Martin series strongly features the class system before and during World War I, and the follow-on series focus on the home front during World War II. She also writes about spies and spycraft from the early part of the 20th century. And her Truth series features a character with severe difficulties in understanding the emotions of others and relies on body language, and who's also a PDSD sufferer, which is, I think, interesting. We've got a very diverse historical fiction, but it's extremely diverse, these two authors, so really enjoy this hour with them.
It's fun. Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you. That's what we were going to talk about first, wasn't it?
Yeah. So how do we want to start now, Caroline? Because we're actually going to tell people how, our writing careers.
Let me think. I'll put a plug in for my my young adult novel, because that's coming out in May. It's not in the least bit historical. It's called Fake News, and it is my response to the last president of the United States, because he drove me so nuts I had to write about something. When it comes to crime and historical stuff, as Lindsay said, I concentrate on World War I, World War II. My characters are unusual because they're female. Both protagonists are female, and they become spies in the British intelligence service. There's a little bit of bending of truths, because although in the First World War women were used as assets, I'm not aware of any. Well, it's arguable that there might have been female spies, and I spend a lot of time reading about spycraft and documents that say declassified on them and things like that. And if you look at my internet web search, all historical writers, it's always bad. Mine is even worse than most. Yeah. So that was sort of like, that was where my focus is at the moment, especially my history. And I have always written. I've always told stories. I was always, even in primary school, the only times I was even remotely popular was when I was telling a story. So I was kind of, what would you say, conditioned into storytelling. But I also always have stories running in my head. I have a very overactive imagination. So it's nice to put it in places other than just letting it roam free, because it can be quite destructive to me, not to anyone else, if I don't do something with it. And I met Chris a little while ago, but it's taken me a long time to get around to reading Chris's books, which I'm quite ashamed of. And Chris has a remarkably fluid and clear style that I really admire. So on you go, Chris, your turn, introducing you.
That's very nice words. but but like you, Caroline, I think I had stories running in my head when I was a kid, when I was at school. I mean, I made up all these stories in my head. But I mean, I come from a working class background, and working class backgrounds, writers weren't real people. The books are real, but the writers weren't real. So you never for a moment imagined you could actually write these stories down and publish them. So that went on until I was, I think, in my mid-20s. And I remember I wrote a short, I started this kind of course, not an online course. They send you the stuff. Yeah. And you could pay for it one lesson at a time, which is why I did it, because I didn't have that much money. And I think I did the first 2 lessons, and I sent a story to the Sunday. And at that time, I told my mother-in-law what I was doing, and she said, "Why would anyone want to do that?" That put me off writing for many, many years. And it wasn't until about 1989, 1990 I started writing again. Although way back in the early years, I did send one short story to the Sunday Post and got what I now know is a rave review. At that time, it was just a rave rejection. At that time, it was just a rejection, so I didn't do anything else. If I had been more knowledgeable, I would have known that if I'd worked on it, they would have taken it. But anyway, that was the start of me in writing. And then, of course, once I got into it, short stories, articles, I'd written 4 books before I got published. It was difficult to get published then. It's even more difficult now with a traditional publisher. And it was only winning the Dundee International Book Prize that got me in. And that was with a contemporary thriller, not a historical one. So basically, I had 2 historicals in the bottom drawer, another contemporary, and that stuck me in the contemporary box for my first 3 books. Because traditional publishers, when they give you a contract, they want you to write the same thing over and over again. So it was only when I broke from them that I started to write history. So yeah. But I love my Kirsty Campbell. I got the idea for Kirsty from the research I did for my articles. All my articles were historical, social history, that kind of thing. I mean, don't ask me to write about aristocrats or the upper classes. I'm hopeless at that. But the working classes I do know about, and I like to find out how they actually lived and worked, in ages past. So it was during that research I came across the first policewomen. And it was intriguing because the first policewomen came from the suffragettes. And not everyone knows that. The first police women's service were volunteer organisations. The police didn't actually employ policewomen until far later on. But they were ex-suffragettes. It was the suffragette societies that set up the original police force, women's police services, and they were voluntary organisations. And there were 2 of them. There was the Women's Police Volunteers, which a year later became the Women's Police Service, and there was the Voluntary Patrols. Now, the Women's Police Service, they came from the suffragettes. The Women's Patrols came from the National Union of Women's Workers. So you had these 2 organisations, and the Women's Police Service were more like policewomen than the patrollers, because they were like social workers. But again, the Women's Police Service did have a kind of social work kind of ethos. And that's what attracted me to them. Part of their job was ensuring women didn't fall into bad ways.
I was just thinking, it's disappearing. Even today, when you watch it, well, maybe not today, but a little while ago, maybe 10 years ago, if somebody's upset, bring in the woman PC. It's always the women deal with emotions. That's what part of what women were there for. I'm not saying that women can't deal with emotions, of course they can, but there was very much an unwillingness, I think, by the male police force to deal with that side of things.
Yeah.
When you were talking, 2 things occurred to me. One is, it is so easy for somebody to really stomp on your dreams of writing, or to stomp on an idea if you tell them too early. And I think a lot of new writers and beginning writers don't realise that. If you must tell somebody you want to write, tell another writer, because they'll understand. But most people are just sort of like, really? Honestly? Yeah. Or, I mean, my kids for a long time, they're 13 and 19. They've got it now. But for a while, they thought everybody wrote books, because everybody they met through me was writing books. And they thought, well, we need a real job, but maybe write a book or 2. They've gone off that. They think it's too much hard work now they've been watching me. And the other thing, when you were talking about history, when I was at school, history was all about names and dates and everything like that. And what's now known as social history really wasn't around. And that is absolutely what fascinates me. It's what people were actually doing. It's not, it matters who's running a country, because often they invade other countries or their friends or whatever. But it's what people were living as their lives and what they're doing. And I think you do what I do as well, in that we put people in really crucible kind of situations. So it shows who and what they are, because we can all kind of trundle along in everyday life, but it's only when we're pushed that we discover who we are and who others are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of like now.
But you're right. I mean, when the police force started to employ women, they were mainly there to bring the tea to the troops, and things like that. But going back to the early ones, I mean, even they weren't accepted by the main police service. I mean, they did work hand in hand with the Met, the first women's police services, but the ordinary policemen on the ground, I mean, they shouted insults to them and everything. Get back to the kitchen sink, that kind of thing. Get back to your wash tubs, and all that sort of thing. And I think, they did use them when they wanted to use them. But it was a big scandal. Oh, I can't remember when it was, but it was a politician. And he was caught in a park being rather familiar with a young lady. And this working class origin, I think she was a shop worker or something, and there was a big fuss about it. They investigated it, and the policeman interviewed the woman, and that was what created the scandal. And that's what made them realise that, if they were going to interview a woman in a kind of a sexual scandal kind of thing, they really needed women to do it. And I think it was at that time that Lillian Wiles, she was a policewoman, was actually incorporated into the CID. She was the first woman in the CID in the Met, officially, because of that scandal. So, I mean, there's a lot around that. But my Kirsty, I mean, that's where the idea of her came from. The fact that you had these feisty policewomen who were trained in jiu-jitsu, believe it or not.
Well, that's the suffragettes changing, isn't it? I mean, that's what people don't realise, that the suffragettes changing jiu-jitsu. Hope in my World War II is trained in jiu-jitsu. Euphemia in the first book is trained in a variety of martial arts, because women did them. It's just that it wasn't talked about. But they had some world-class people coming over to teach them, the suffragettes, the jiu-jitsu. And, what is remembered is that women attacked. There was a famous one where the police got them all into a square, what we would call kettling now, but they were on horses, and it said that women have been using shoes and umbrellas and baby feeding bottles and all these kind of things, and whereas in actual fact a lot of them would have been trained in self-defense. Harder when a horse is trying to stamp on your head, of course. But it's the image of women throwing domestic objects that is prevalent from that time. And or maybe sometimes the group that went off on their own and set firebombs and all this kind of stuff. But even that's not really remembered. It's mostly women throwing shoes and baby bottles.
Yes. I mean, I find the suffragette, I mean, my Kirsty, because I started 1919 with her as an ex-suffragette, I then became interested in the suffragettes. So my new series is a Suffragette Mysteries, and there's only one book in it so far, but I'll have some more, hopefully. But it was looking at the suffragettes and the different societies, because there was the three different societies. There was the Pankhurst one, I always forget the initials, the National Union of National Social and Political Union. That was the Pankhurst organisation, and they were the most military one. The Women's Freedom League, the women in that originated in the Pankhurst organisation, but they started to get a bit upset because it was a very kind of military-run organisation. It was very authoritarian, and they didn't like the authoritarian stance. You do what you're told, sort of thing. So they broke off and became the Women's Freedom League, who were also militant, but not quite as militant
Mm.
as the Pankhurst lot. They didn't go in for the bombs and things like that, but they did set fire to the litter boxes. They broke windows. They were militant to a certain extent.
Yeah.
And then you had the NUSS, which was the suffragists who didn't believe in, anything violent at all. So I placed my Kirsty in the middle one, the WFL, the Women's Freedom League, because that one appealed to me more than the Pankhurst one. And I think it was the authoritarian bit, in terms of, they were expected to do what they were told. And if you didn't do what you were told, you were thrown out of the organisation. I mean, Emily Wilding, for example, who killed herself under the King's Horse,
Yeah.
they threw her out of the organisation because she was doing things off her own bat and wasn't following orders. But as soon as she killed herself under the King's Horse, well, she didn't get killed immediately, but she died later.
Mm.
They then brought her back into the fold and adopted her as their kind of, yeah. So, I mean, it was all very odd, and quite a few of the suffragettes were fascists as well. The Pankhurst had fascist leanings.
It was terribly popular, especially among the aristocracy. Yeah. In one of the Hope books, which is set later, though much later, set at the start of the First World War, there's still the remnants of fascism. It's always been bubbling underneath in British society, unfortunately. Well, I was going to say maybe it's bubbling a bit higher now at the moment, but yeah. I wrote one book that featured suffragettes, which was
I read that one.
A Death for Us, and that was trying to look at the suffragettes from all sides, from the people that were dealing with them, to the politicians, to people who were using them as scapegoats, and also the fact that I was going to say something really contentious, right? I think that suffragettes only got the vote because they became violent. And I think that's an awful thing to have to say.
Yeah.
I think if they had stayed non-violent and just vocal, probably nothing would have changed. And that is so wrong on so many levels. But do you agree?
Yes, I think I would agree, yeah. But although I do think some of the suffragettes took things a bit too far. I mean, nowadays they'd be labelled as terrorists.
Absolutely. Yes, that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
But it's a fascinating fund of material for stories.
Yes. Lots of really interesting things that went on there. And I mean, I know a lot of people rebel against the word feisty, and it's not my favourite word to describe somebody. You want to try and find another word than feisty. But there were a lot of women at that time. I mean, that's how you have to describe them, because they were set a particular way of living, a particular way of behaving, and they chose to step outside of that. Sometimes it was through necessity, sometimes it was through choice, but the fact that they continued like that is pretty amazing. And I think all my heroines and yours come into that category, where they are extraordinary women. But I would argue that my extraordinary women are extraordinary because of circumstances, but that all women can be extraordinary.
Yeah.
Given the chance, maybe some of them are more apt to make the chance. And it's terrible, isn't it? The older I get, the more of a feminist I become. And we're not allowed to say feminist anymore, are we?
No.
Egalitarian. The more I believe in that women can do anything. How about that? Stick with that one. No, my Euphemia, you were saying who inspired you. My Euphemia is inspired by my great grandmother. Her father remarried. She hated her new stepmother, and she came from I think a terribly well-to-do family with loads of money. And her father said, well, either you get on with your new stepmother or you hop it. So she hopped it. And she went into service, because the two choices for what she could do from the way she'd been brought up, if she wasn't going to marry, and obviously she couldn't marry without a dowry into her own circle, and she didn't know anyone else, well, she had the choice between becoming a prostitute or becoming a maid. So she became a maid, and which is what Euphemia does. Euphemia's family get thrown into destitution and she becomes a maid, and on her first day she's dragging a dead body around by its leg, and life just takes off from there. But she became a maid, and the work was incredibly hard, and she became very ill. So she didn't go, my great-grandmother didn't go on to discover murders. She was rescued by a tobacconist who she married, and they had 13 children, all of whom survived. Well, the unusual part is that they all survived. And I remember talking to somebody who's a friend who worked in the NHS, and she said, you know why? She said it's because the mother had a really good life up until that point, was actually physically very healthy. So therefore her children were more healthy. So yeah, these 13 children survived. But so I hope it was a happy marriage. There were 13 children, so there must have been moments, hopefully.
A lot of moments.
I was thinking of the joys that children bring. She says one of them is safely in bed and the other one is upstairs watching TV. Yeah. But so yes, that's what. And I just remember dreaming about her one night, and when I woke up the next morning, I thought that could be somebody who goes from. My character is. She's a vicar's daughter, but she's related to an earl. Her mother is the third or fourth daughter of an earl, but that family's never talked to her. And eventually she finds out, this isn't giving away much about the story, that her mother in her own way was just as rebellious. Her mother, who she thinks is a very ordinary woman, who's very sort of toes the line and wants to be back in her own social class, actually ran off with the curate and married the curate, who's her father. So in her own day, she was just as willful. So there's a kind of genetic history of willfulness in there, except that her mother then went back, well, didn't go back to the family, but then kind of settled down. Euphemia, by halfway through my series, is married, but I don't think anyone could accuse her of settling down.
I must admit, I really love Euphemia. I mean, I had read your books in the past, and so when this was coming up, I reread the ones I'd read before, and then I read through to the more recent ones. So I've got a really, really good feel of Euphemia all the way through, and I absolutely fell in love with her. One thing that I did wonder about was why you made her a maid rather than a governess, because a lot of upper class women who fell in hard times became governesses because they had more status than a maid.
Well, when she starts, she's 18. She's applying to things behind her mother's back. She doesn't know anybody or anything, so she just thinks, I'm just going to. I'm at being a housekeeper, because one of the things that her mother has done is her mother has still hopefully prepared her for marriage in the hope that one day that her own, Euphemia's grandfather will come back and reintroduce her to society. So her mother spent a lot of time teaching her how to run a big house. Because her mother says at one point, if a quote that Euphemia never forgets, is that intelligence on a girl is as much use as a pair of hooves. And Euphemia says, well, there would be a great saving on shoes, and it goes downhill from there. But her father, you're right, her father has educated her, but he's educated her more. He would have educated a son. He's taught her Latin and Greek and philosophy and the kind of things that she probably wouldn't be expected to teach as a governess. She doesn't have any European languages, and a lot of the things that probably a governess would teach she doesn't know, and I think her knowledge of geography is very poor as well, a bit like mine. So she wouldn't be able to teach the things you'd employ a governess for. She would be able to teach the things you'd employ a tutor for, like for a boy. That wouldn't have gone on. So at the time, she's quite desperate. So she just thinks, well, what else can I do? I know how to run a household. And she says right at the start, I'm going in as a maid. Give me 3 months, I'll be a housekeeper. She has no idea. She has no idea that people spent their entire careers working from being a tweenie all the way up to being a housekeeper. It wasn't sort of promotion of merit as much as anything. It was just dead people's shoes. That you just gradually, you moved up, you stayed with the family, and it was a lifelong commitment. As far as she's concerned, oh yeah, I'll do that 3 months.
That makes a lot of sense. But one thing I did notice is that there's the very distinct class system in your novels, which comes across quite clearly. And, during the course of novels, I mean, I don't know, I've given away things here, but during the course of the novels, Euphemia kind of graduates into the upper classes again. She kind of, moves between the classes. And I did wonder, in terms of that, whether that was what you meant in the beginning or whether Euphemia actually dictated that. Because as you know, your characters often tell you what they want done.
Absolutely. They do. They are kind of like that, aren't they? I think that because Euphemia is smart and because she can do certain things, she got pulled up. She became a companion, and she gradually she could hold her own with what were so-called her superiors. In fact, the people that she deals with are often very concerned that she's of a lower class, whereas in actual fact she's actually of a higher class than them, but they don't know.
Yeah, that comes across.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to do was position her between the two classes, the working class and the upper class. And for the most part, especially in the early novels, she's very clear that her friendships and the people that really matter to her, and the people she likes and respects, are always in the lower class. She doesn't particularly like the way the upper class operates. She does find good people within it, because there's good people within everything. But I wanted her to be somebody who could be a bridge between the two classes and see the faults in both sides.
Yeah.
But I have to say, I think she sees most of her faults in the upper class, which obviously, I mean, her mother is just shocked. Because her mother is definitely, she's a grand dame. She's less than 5 feet. And when she was a young woman courting, she could make a duke cry by saying the right thing. She's very proud of herself. So they're very different characters. Whereas Euphemia is much more about finding people she can trust and care for. And I think more like her father, because she spent time learning with her father. So she was always designed to be between them. I think we need to talk about your books in a minute, but I will just add one more thing. The only character who did whatever they wanted, who pushed their way into their series, and who now has a major role and whose diary I write every Friday, is Fitzroy.
I love Fitzroy.
He was meant to be a background character. He's not meant to be particularly important. And yeah, he's become kind of like one of the stage and centre characters, and he features in both series now. Yes. Yeah, so
I do have a question about Fitzroy, because you've gone on to your Hope books, and at the time you wrote the last Euphemia ones, you hadn't had Hope. Hope wasn't born. Yeah,
born at
so
the
I'm
end.
thinking you're going to follow on with some Euphemias with that around. Yes. And one thing I did wonder: would Euphemia and Fitzroy maybe have had a moment?
Wow.
Is Bertram really her father?
Actually, in the very latest Hope book, which is I'll have some class, won't flash my covers. In the very latest Hope book, that's exactly what Hope is wondering, and she's born on Armistice Day, which is why she's called Hope. So you know exactly when she's born, and Euphemia and Fitzroy are working very closely together around that time. And in the second Hope book, one of the things she's trying to find out is whether or not Bertram is her father, or is it possible that Fitzroy is her father?
Oh, must read that.
But she doesn't find out in that book, I'll say, but she's beginning to get very worried. There's part of the theme in the Hope stories is her trying to find out her history and trying to find out the bits that we won't necessarily see in full. Because obviously the series at the moment, I think, is quite confusing. They're being written in parallel. Euphemia is in 1915, 16, I think.
It was First World War anyway.
Yeah. She's got, her next one comes out in June, which is A Death on Stage. And you find out her relationship with Fitzroy changes very dramatically in that book, and you'll find out why. And her relationship with Bertram also changes very dramatically in that book. So yeah, there's some of your answers are there. But I've got to think about what I was going to say next.
I must admit, I was more attracted to Fitzroy than Bertram. But Fitzroy's a bad boy.
He says himself, he's an absolute rotter.
I know. I like bad boys.
I know, everybody does. If you read this Friday's The one I just put up, this Fitzroy's Diary, I do a short extract from it. So they're not in chronological order, which sometimes confuses people, but I do that deliberately not to give away too much, although there's lots of bits and pieces seeded in there. But his latest one is, about how he seduces women for information and things like that, and he's quite proud of how he can do that, and he's very sort of like how romantic he can be and how persuasive and charming, and he knows all this. He says, I'd make a lousy husband because I can only do it for like 3 months at a stretch, and then I go back to who I really am. Yeah, he's the character that so many readers really like. He's really not about him. I keep telling him that. It's about Euphemia.
He's got a soft spot for Euphemia.
Oh, he adores Euphemia. He doesn't say so. I mean, he's adored Euphemia for lots of the books. He's just never said so to her face. In fact, if you watch the way he behaves, it's very clear. He likes women as well. He also respects women, and he believes, despite seducing them, he also believes that women are the equal to men, but not necessarily in every field. But he has a lot of respect for women, and in those books, he says, oh, of course, women should get the vote, but you're not going to get it now. It's just how the political circumstances are. You'll get it later, but you're not going to get it now. There's no point wasting time on it, which doesn't go down awfully well because he's right. But yeah, bad boys. Why do women like bad boys? He does come through for her whenever she needs him, though. So that's I could say a lot more, but I'm shutting up now. So you've written contemporary, you've written historical, and we've talked a little bit about Kirsty. Who is your favourite female protagonist that you write? Who are you drawn to again and again?
Definitely Kirsty. I mean, I really like Kirsty. I mean, my contemporary ones have got a male main character, and the thing was, I meant to have a female one, Sue. She was meant to be the main one, but Bill came on the scene and elbowed her out of the way, as characters do, so he became the main one. But Kirsty in my historical, she's definitely my main character, and I have Kirsty in my new one, the Suffragettes mysteries as well, because when I was writing the Kirsty Campbell mysteries, of course, Kirsty's got a backstory. She's quite a prickly personality, but there's a vulnerability there as well. And I mean, she really doesn't like men all that much because she had an unfortunate experience when she was 15, and she had a child as a result of it. Her mother and father are bringing the child up as her sister, and that caused a great split within the family. So, I'd been writing these books with Kirsty's backstory there, and then I decided to do the Suffragette mysteries. So I took the Kirsty ones of 1917 and 1919. That's First World War, before and after. The Suffragette mysteries, the new one, I've got the thing here, that's it, Dangerous Destiny. It is...
That's what I'm currently reading, yeah.
Oh, lovely. It's set in 1908, and it arose from Kirsty's backstory. So in that book, I have Kirsty, she's only about, what is she, 18, 19?
She's very young. She's very young. And
she's young. She is young, because the coming of age is 21 and back in those days, but she's about 18 or 19, and she's being really held down by her family.
Yeah.
So she teams up. I mean, basically, I bring her through kind of the bad experience, the child, the fuss with her family. She really feels held down. She feels held down. She wants to escape. So she becomes involved with the suffragettes. So I have 3 suffragettes in this book. I've got Kirsty, who is not a suffragette at that point, but is becoming interested. I've got Martha, who's a seasoned suffragette,
isn't she? At the start, she's a window suffragette. She's watching. She's very much watching.
Oh, yes, Kirsty's watching what's going on in Albert Square. There's a suffragette meeting with Christabel Pankhurst talking. So I have Martha, who's a seasoned suffragette. She's a bit older than Kirsty. She's about 30. And
she's old then.
Yes, she's old. She takes suffragettes under her wing. And we've got Ethel, who is a mill worker and comes from an abusive background. Yes. So Ethel needs to escape her background as well. So Martha takes her under her wing and offers her a roof over her head, which the suffragettes did in those days. And then Kirsty starts to get involved, and then they become involved in this murder. Someone's killing suffragettes in Dundee. He's strangling them with their sashes, the suffragette sashes.
The purple and white ones, yeah.
Yeah. And the police aren't interested. It's a question of, they're just suffragettes, quadrants to bad rubbish sort of style. So they decide they want to find out who's doing this because their friends are getting murdered. So that's where the story goes, and all Kirsty's backstory is wound into this, and Ethel's backstory is wound into it. And at the end of the book, they have to get out of Dundee because otherwise Kirsty will be pulled back into her family. Ethel will be hunted down by her abusive father. So basically, I liked it. I liked writing it. I found it quite interesting. So that was Dundee.
No,
so I'm going to take them either. I haven't made up my mind where I'm taking them next. It'll either be Aberdeen, Edinburgh, or Glasgow, and we will have another story set somewhere else. Once they've kind of escaped their backgrounds. But Kirsty, I mean, she's vulnerable, and when she becomes a policewoman, she's prickly, and because of this event in her background where she was raped, she doesn't want to get involved with men. Oh, I forgot to say that Kirsty is not a lesbian. She does share a bed with Ethel, at the end of Dangerous Destiny, because that's what the suffragettes did. They moved around the country, and the other suffragettes offered them beds, and they often slept together like that. And it wasn't thought anything of in those days, but she's not a lesbian.
It was cold. I memean, people slept together because it was cold.
Yes. And Ethel's a bit flirty anyway. She likes men. Well, not in this one, but she will. But Kirsty doesn't. I mean, she kind of, she's kind of reserved. She does get into a kind of a semi-relationship in Devil's Porridge, but she's unable to carry it through. And basically, the man in that one would have married her, but she doesn't want to carry it through because she can't follow through with that. And it's just that kind of situation. So normally she relies on her women colleagues, to let off steam. So when she comes to Dundee, she has no women colleagues. I mean, she's on her own in a male police force, and a male police force who don't particularly want her there. So she becomes even more prickly, and she often sees slights where none exist. Because Jamie Brewster, who's her boss, he's quite accepting of her, but she doesn't see that. She just sees all these slights and that people are holding her back. So she goes out on her own and she does things, that basically, she shouldn't really do, and gets herself into pickles and, and danger, risk, so it's just, it's just the way things go.
I mean, pickles is the word, deadly peril pickles. Yeah.
Yes, deadly peril pickles. Well, she does get into trouble, she does get. And basically it's because she goes off on her own and does things that she's not supposed to do. I mean, she doesn't kind of, let people know where she is. She doesn't pull in a male to go with her because, she's so hung up on this, they don't want me kind of thing. But I mean, a lot of them didn't. I mean, there were,
It's really interesting. Yeah, because you're seeing it from both sides. You're seeing the discrimination is obviously very present. But has such an effect that the person who's being discriminated against kind of sees everybody as the enemy.
Yeah. Yes. So that's where she's at. That's where she's at.
Yeah. I love the way you say she's prickly, because women are prickly or bossy or difficult. Yeah. Whereas if they were men, they would be strong.
Yes.
Or capable or independent.
Yeah.
But in that time, and sometimes this time as well, it is about that difficult woman. Oh, she's so difficult. Whereas in actual fact, if she suddenly changed into a man, she'd just be somebody who stood up for what she thought. Yeah,
most of my reviews for my Kirsty books are positive, but I did have one person who commented, I think it was a man, who commented that he found it too feminist.
Right. I think we should
I'm not really writing feminist books. It's just how Kirsty is.
Yes, I think I was going to comment and say that I do actually like men. I live in a household of men. I have a male partner and two boys, and my boys are, I would say, probably devout feminists. Oh no, it's this thing. I mean, you talked about one of your characters being raped, and I remember something came up, and I had to describe to my younger son, who's known in my blogs and everything as the bear, what rape was. and he actually started to cry and said, why would anyone do that? And I think I've done okay. There's a bit I've done okay in parenting. There's a whole lot of stuff I've done wrong, but that bit's okay. I suppose, I mean, I keep sort of talking about feminism, but there is a lot about female roles in the times that we're writing about.
Yeah.
With women who aimed for equality were different. Euphemia is drawn a little bit towards the suffragettes, and at one point she's a companion to somebody who is of a class who's very selfish, becomes less selfish as the time goes on, Rishenda, and because she wants to be a suffragette, she dresses Euphemia in suffragette colours. And she has no sense to style or clothing. So Euphemia finds all these gifts of clothes that are purple and green, and she's thinking, why am I being dressed as a mouldy cabbage? Until one time Rishenda said, oh, let's go to London and have a girls' day out. And it turns out she wants to go on a suffragette march. And that's when Euphemia, of course, Rishenda, she's one of those people that she walks into things and gets away with it. Whereas Euphemia ends up in the march and then ends up in prison. She gets caught up in the riots, and she's just trying to stay out of it. And she sees an officer on a horse trying to hit a woman with a baton. So she yanks him off his horse and punches him in the face. This is before she's got any real training and ends up in jail. And that really attracts Fitzroy's attention. And he says, oh, that's interesting. It's interesting. Interesting woman. Right, okay. One of the women in this cell of suffragettes is actually a murderer. Don't think it's anything to do with the movement. So I'm going to put you in the cell with the murderer, and can you work out which one it is, please? And, you know, to say thank you, every now and then, I'll take you out, pretend to talk to you, and just give you pudding. Now that's a good deal, isn't it? I suppose. I mean, a lot of my stuff is, I think, is quite funny, but it's only funny because a lot of it is also quite dark. And I think I kind of go that way. There are some very comic moments where I think your style's much more natural, much more clear. I always think about when I'm reading your work, Chris. I always think I'm swimming in crystal waters. That's what it's like when I'm reading yours. There's a kind of a sense of the time, and it feels almost as if you're. It's like live reporting or a live newspaper or something. But at the same time, it's not saying it's not filled with character and filled with people, but there's this kind of sort of clarity of being immersed in that time, which is quite lovely. So I really enjoy reading your work. I mean, we were talking offline, and you were saying, we both agreed we did a lot of historical search, and you said, I can never remember dates and things like that. And I just open your book and it's dripping with history. Whereas, I mean, I research history too, and I quite often look for events that will fit with what I'm doing with my characters. I definitely feel myself as an invader of history. I would never say I was a historian. I invade history and use it to develop my characters. Whereas I think you're much more, there is history within which your characters flow. So
that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I have no head for dates or who was in power or who was on the throne even at a specific time. I've got to look it up, and I usually do a timeline of what's happening.
Yes.
That I can refer to. In such and such a date, such and such happened. Like in Devil's Porridge, I mean, for example, I have an assassination attempt on King George. Now I had to look up who's on the throne, who I was going to assassinate. And King George and Queen Mary actually visited Gretna in 1916 in May, and my book is set between December and February, so I had to extend the actual timeline of the book to fit the assassination attempt.
Yeah, so there's another assassination attempt, I'm sure there is, around the time of the Great Exhibition as well. Because at some point Fitzroy disappears and they work out that he's actually guarding the king. And he doesn't like that. He doesn't like being close to the people that are on the crown because he believes in crown and country, but he doesn't actually like meeting the physical embodiment of them because that's always a letdown.
Okay. Now, I wonder if Fitzroy was at Gretna when King George was there and my assassination attempt was made.
Might have been. He's very cagey about where he is, and he often lets the most interesting things about himself when he could have been at home cutting his toenails. But yeah. I don't think, one of the things I'm trying to remember, I don't think any of your characters ever end up with any pets, do they? I gave Fitzroy a companion dog.
No. I do have a pet in one of my contemporary ones, and I made a mortal sin. I killed a cat. I know, a mortal sin. I didn't know I wasn't supposed to kill a cat. I can kill as many people as I want, but
yeah, absolutely. But
no one's actually picked up on it with me. You know, no one's actually accused me of murder of a cat.
Being a cat killer.
Yeah. So I apologise to everyone for killing a cat.
No, I mean, because Fitzroy is such a lone character, and it's kind of by accident. He ends up with a dog, and he ends up with a bull terrier, with the ones that have heads rather like rugby balls. It's a very unusual looking dog, and they don't really bark; they more sort of whiffle.
Yeah.
But you know, if anybody hurt his dog,
yeah. Oh, Kirsty had a horse in her early days. Does that count?
Yes, it does. It was something about for me being able to show that characters have empathy. Because Richenda has a horse that she adores as well. It always seems to be a redeeming feature of people if they can have this empathy and connection with animals. Because I think that in the most part, connection with animals makes people a better person. You know, more understanding of the nature of, I'm sorry, I'm going philosophical, life and stuff. Anyway, Fitzroy, my diary last week was the week before last. He was taking his dog down to Harrods to see if they had a tasting menu for him, because he felt he was getting a bit out of touch with the real world.
I must remember to introduce pets in future, but I don't think Kirsty would have space for a pet.
No,
she's got plenty of mice in her flat.
Because she might get a cat, or it might be a stray cat adopts her.
Yeah.
I mean, to come and eat the mice. Yeah, because they're a real problem. I mean, mice, because they breed so fast as well. And a lot of cats were working cats. They weren't the monkeys we have now. So maybe
there's an idea.
She could meet, again, it happened here. She could meet a working cat who maybe even has kittens, but you know, is a working cat mother. But you know what I mean? I mean, animals can also be a reflection of the characters, obviously, as well. And it's not just how people care for them, but the same kind of thing.
I actually have a cat sitting on my table here. I'll let you see it. This is in case one of my friends from UK CBC came on, because we have a standing joke about a typing cat. So this is my cat.
Oh,
I did actually have a cat like that. Way back. But that was, you know,
oh, Chris, you disappeared.
Past just new.
Right. I had 2 cats before I had children. And my oldest cat stayed around. One of the cats got rehomed with a relative because they didn't like children, but my oldest cat stayed around. But I have a cat on my desk, but it's not actually a cat. It is how Fitzroy would see himself if he was an animal. He'd see himself as a Barbary lion. This is my Fitzroy. He sits there and he looks, you know, trying to turn it the right way. He looks extremely smug most of the time. And, you know, when I'm stuck and I'm writing, he looks at me and goes, yes, I think I would do this now. And I'm sort of like, no, you can't do that. I wreck the whole plot. Because I plan my plots. I don't plan it all. Some of it is organic, but with the organic bits are when the characters, like you say, decide that they want to do something entirely different to what you'd intended.
Did you say you plan your plot? You're a plotter then, not a pantster?
Oh, I'm definitely not a pantster. I have the outline of a plot, and then the bits in between it can be quite organic. But I generally know who the villain is, and also because I'm doing something historical, I always know I'm going. What about you?
I'm a pantster.
You're a pantster.
I take an event and I work from there. I mean, for example, in one of my contemporary ones, the only thing I had at the beginning was the vision of this girl being held by her throat by 2 very well-dressed men. You remember the 2 villains in one of the Bond movies who were always dapper? Well, they were like them, and they had her by the throat and her legs were dangling. And that's all I had. And that was dead wood. And I took it from there and built the story from that. So definitely a pantster. I mean, I find if I plan too much, my writing's too stilted. It doesn't flow to the same extent.
I think I have more plot points, and sometimes it's how I'm getting between those.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then something else will happen in between, but I definitely have a structure.
I sometimes don't even know who did it until the end,
I couldn't do that.
which means I've got to keep a timeline as I'm going to make sure that everyone's in the right place at the right time. I think we've got Lindsay back again.
She's on mute at the moment.
I'm on mute, yeah. I always forget to do that. I tell everybody about to unmute themselves, but I forget to do it myself. I've got a question from Wendy, author Wendy Jones, and she's asking, how much research did you both do for these books that you've been talking about?
Didn't quite catch that.
How much research do we do for the books that we've been talking about? Lots. I write one Hope book a year, so I spend a year reading about aspects of World War II, even though that's probably the war I'm more familiar with because I have relatives who fought in it. Mind you, I have relatives who fought in the First World War as well, of course. Euphemia ones, I do intensive research around them. Hope, I do like a year-long piece of research for them. What about you, Chris?
I read a lot around my topic, you know, my subject. I mean, I've read a lot of suffragette material, I've read a lot of World War I material, you know, that kind of things. I do read a lot about that, but it's the smaller research I sometimes, you know, find takes up the time once you're actually writing. But you've got all this, and you've got all your research in the back of your head, but then you hit something, you thought, oh God, how does that work? Like in Devil's Porridge, I had a Kirsty being driven to the prison, and I had to find out, how do you start a vintage car? How do you drive a vintage car? What does it look like? So basically I spent 3 days on YouTube learning how to start and drive a vintage car. Now in real life, if you stuck that vintage car at my door, I could probably drive it. But that resulted in about one paragraph in Devil's Porridge. So that's 3 days research for one paragraph.
It can be so painful doing that, can't it? But it's necessary, even just for your own understanding, because you write more differently. A death at the races.
Yeah,
it's a fake Monte Carlo rally. I spent ages working out how you get around the Monte Carlo rally in that time.
It's the simple things that people will pick you up on, like in terms of when you start your car, is it a static starting handle or does it come off? You know, things like that. What does the car look? Does it have a running board? You know, things like that. Just simple things.
It was actually, for me, I needed to find out what kind of underwear they wore when they were driving over the Alps. That was one of the things. I don't think it actually is mentioned explicitly in the books, but I needed to know what they wore.
I love that book, by the way. I think that was one of my favourites, the one that took them to the Alps.
I like that one very much as well. It was fun. I think, to be honest, I don't know about you, but I've been learning how to write novels as I've been going on. So when people say, do I need to start at Euphemia 1? I always used to say, start around about 9. 9's good. A Death for King and Country, that's good. Start there. The others are fine, but you don't. You can read them if you want. They're great to go back to, but start at number 9 if you're intimidated by how many there are.
I like the progression from, you know, you started out as kind of cosy murder mystery, and then it kind of evolved into spy novels with a murder in them, and you know that progression was, you know, it was really interesting.
Well, once Fitzroy was on the scene, we had to stay with spies. That was really interesting as well, and that kind of, I mean, from a Death for King and Country, it's very much spy stories. But did you find that as you wrote, your books became, well, I would say mine become better written, to be frank. But what about you? Did you find that you found writing novels became more, I don't know, fluid or whatever? Definitely, the process changed for me the more I wrote, I found.
I find every novel difficult. I mean, and you always get to that bit in the middle where you think, oh God, this is going nowhere and this is crap. I'm at that at the moment with the one I'm writing.
That's the problem with being a pantster.
Yes, I know. I must take lessons from you how to plot.
Not necessarily. If it works for you, fine, but you get that angst. I get the overall angst because my idea of good or not, but it's because it's all the way through.
Yeah.
So another question from Wendy was like, she wanted to know where Caroline got her love of the First and Second World War from, and Chris, why why did you become interested in the suffragettes?
Well, for me, it's a couple of reasons. I have family who served in both wars and who have quite intensive stories in both wars. In the First World War, my paternal grandfather was something that comes up in the books later on. He was a spotter. He was out at front looking at what was going on, and he got bombed and trapped in an area with all his mates who were dead, and then he got gassed at the same time, and it had a massive influence on the family. I also find how people work and operate under really intense periods of stress fascinating, and of course World War One is very different from World War Two in the sense that the enemy is always, it's odd, you know, Nazism or everything like that, obviously we would stand against, except we didn't stand against it for ages because we were too worried about protecting India, but that's another story. But the First World War is a war that I think a lot of people didn't understand at the time, because the two peoples were very united, and that was a very strange war. And then World War Two, my other grandfather was a firefighter in London docks. And he's told the most remarkable stories, like climbing up in the night to kick off incendiary bombs off the roofs of things around the docks. And then when daylight comes up, they realize how high up they are and they can't get down because they're just petrified at how high they are. So they have to get the big ladders and gradually get them down. What do you mean? They kick the bombs off, they stop the things from burning, which was their job. But again, it has an effect on our family. And I think I'm just fascinated by what ordinary people do in extraordinary times. So
yeah, I mean, my half, why am I interested in the suffragettes? I think I fell into that kind of by accident because, I mean, I actually started writing about Kirsty and the early women's police service because I'd been doing research for articles, and that fascinated me. And I'm also fascinated by the First World War period, but it was discovering that Kirsty's background, you know, that a lot of the early women police had been suffragettes, that I started to become interested in suffragettes. And as I started to read more, my interest just grew. So basically, that's all there is to it. So I've read quite a lot about suffragettes now. There's quite a good book about suffragettes done by Norman Watson, I think it is, that I found really helpful on the Scottish scene because the Scottish suffragettes developed at a slower rate than the London ones. I mean, when the London suffragettes were being really militant about, when would it have been? About 1908, 1909. The Scottish ones didn't become militant until much later. The first forced feeding was in 1914 in Scotland, in Edinburgh, whereas in London they'd been doing it since about 1908 or 1909. So there were differences in terms of, you know, how it developed in Scotland. It was a different situation altogether. They had thought about forced feeding at an earlier stage at Dundee, I think about a year before, and it was the Dundee court, and they ruled it out.
I think
So,
it's
I mean, it's just interesting.
It's also, it's kind of like the long fingers of history, isn't it, that reach down and affect our lives, because obviously the suffragettes changed the lives of all women that live today. And in the same way that the World War has changed people on both political and social levels. These are major things in the past that have helped create who we are.
Definitely. This is just myself. So, have you ever considered also going back to your contemporary Dundee crime series?
Me?
Yes.
My Dundee crime series. The one I'm writing at the moment is a Dundee crime series one. That's the one I'm in the middle of it, at the saggy middle, where I'm kind of thinking, where the heck does this go now? So yes, there will be a Dundee crime series one coming out, hopefully, once I get over this COVID fog in my brain.
Yeah. And Caroline, have you ever considered to write a contemporary crime series, or have you always just had a love for like the historical crime?
I've written bits and pieces of contemporary. I mean, Daniel Truce is contemporary. I've even written a couple of romances, though I couldn't keep the murders out. They're emerging in both of my romances that I wrote, Highland Inheritance and Playing for Love. I, at the moment, I think I'm desperately in love with my characters in Euphemia and in Hope. So I'm actually working on other things. I mean, the fake news one is a contemporary one set in Scotland, coming out in May. But I think it'll be a long time before I step away from Euphemia and Hope entirely, because they're just.
I'm starting to feel a niche to write another saga, actually. I have one saga which I wrote the year sagas went out of fashion, which was why I don't stop at one. And why I turned to a life of crime. Why my timing was rotten. So I have this one saga set in the 1830s in the fishing community. And I had ideas for 2 more at the time, which I didn't do because, of course, being out of fashion, out of fashion, the publishers, I'm not sure about the readers. So those 2 were stuck away back in the back burner. I'm starting to get an itch to do the second one. And I'm not sure if I'll do that after I've finished my contemporary one. It might be the spur to get me to contemporary one if I want to do this other one.
Well, I mean,
there's no murder in them. Might be deaths, but no.
A lot of people have actually said, Wendy again has said things like both Euphemia and Kirsty Campbell are great characters, women after my own heart. So I think a lot of people do have a love for the historical crime, because like I say, the historical, we're so rich in our history of things that went down that yes, they were awful, they were awful what actually happened to these women, but obviously it's part of our past and we should celebrate it and say, right, this is where we went wrong, keep, this is learn from the past kind of style. We don't, but it's rather than completely whitewashing it or getting rid of it, I think we should learn from it and say, this is what happened in the past, look how bad it was, let's learn from, I keep saying, let's learn from that.
Those that don't appreciate history are doomed to repeat it.
Yeah, that's it. We shouldn't repeat it in the future, kind of style, but obviously, and some of these, they might not be an exact repeat, but they do sound.
It's in human nature to have to repeat mistakes and do things again and again, and the hope is that every time that we go through a loop of something like that, we learn a little bit more.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I obviously know. I think a lot of people that know a lot about World War II and why World War II started. World War I know from like history class. It was a lot. I mean, even as young children, we really didn't. We had a basic understanding of what started World War I, but not as much as what started World War II. I don't know if because World War II was more, we knew it was the Allied forces against Germany, whereas World War I there was a lot more, like countries involved. Actually, was the starting point. Well, World War II, we know what the starting point was like Germany invading other countries in Europe. So it's really interesting to read it, because a lot of people say historical crime is not for them, but when they actually read books, they actually realize, oh wow, you take a little bit of it. Wow, that's how, like saying, like when you're talking about.
I was going to say, there's a bit in Scotland's history. Scotland almost became cut in two during World War One, because in one of the books, The Death in the Loch, you talk about the dreadnoughts, which were the massive, great big ships that were built at the Clyde on the west coast, and they needed to be on the other side of Scotland to fight. And that meant you either took them over the top, around the bottom, and that took too long because the German fleet was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And often you could, some of the worst areas in the world are if you go around the top of Scotland, sea-wise. So they thought that what they do is they drill right the way along the canal and just separate Scotland off and open it up so it's wide enough to take a dreadnought down the middle. Now, that is absolutely true. I mean, that was, and people think that was a plan on the table in London at the time, and it didn't come to fruition, and nobody quite saw why. So I wrote a reason why it didn't happen. Nobody actually knows why it didn't happen, but it was a real plan, and there were some really crazy and fascinating things that people do around those times. But yeah, Scotland almost got chopped up.
Yeah, I'm sure they would be glad of it. Will not talk politics. Thank you so much, Louise. That's the end of the session. So the next session at 3 o'clock to 4 is Mary Grant and Diane Saxon. That is Murder Most Foil, authors to look out for, which is really interesting because I learned after I put them together, they were actually the same publishing company, Boldwood. I didn't actually put them together. I kind of went for people like yourselves that were historical crime or people that hadn't been together in last year's panels to just sort of like spice up a little bit or had completely in common. But I didn't actually listen until I think it was Diane or Mary that she said, "Oh, that's great. We know each other. We're both publishing buddies." I was like, "Oh, right, I didn't actually know that." So that would be interesting to hear them speak about. Thank you so much, Caroline, for a really interesting hour about like the suffragettes in World War I and World War II. And definitely, if you get the chance, have a look for the Kirsty Campbell books and the Euphemia mysteries because they are really interesting. I'm not a big historical crime reader, but I've read both of them and I absolutely love them. It's just so interesting, and you get lost and you kind of realise things that obviously some of it you're given a reason for, but it is really interesting just to learn these sort of facts or just learn all these things. So definitely go when the library's open or when the bookshop's open, see if you can get yourself a copy of either of these books. We've got Leslie Kelly saying that was really interesting, thank you all, and Wendy said you guys are being fabulous, thank you. Helen Forbes says great event, thank you. So yeah, it's absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having it. It's been a pleasure.